Too long, didn't revise.
Yo, today we're going to be going over metaethics. So a couple of definitions you need to keep in mind is that metaethics itself is the study of ethical language. Ethical language is terminology specific to ethics. Cognitive means that it can be proven with evidence. Meaningful means it's significant in some form. I put some form because basically every single philosopher has a different idea of what meaningful means, meaning that meaning itself has no meaning. And then moral realism is that morality exists separate to humans, so whether we exist or not, morality is still a thing. So there's three main branches that you need to know, and that's naturalism, propositions that are objective and verifiable in the natural physical world. Intuitionism is also known as ethical non-naturalism, so propositions are reflections of our universal moral intuition. Apparently that's a thing. And then emotivism, proposition and language used are reflections of our emotions. Then this one is just an extra because in B questions it's so useful because it goes against every single one of them. So it's error theory, also known as moral anti-realism, where basically all propositions are not factual as the concept of morality itself is constructed, whether that's by our minds or society is up for debate, but yeah. So on naturalism, you got a ton of shit you can stick in the introduction. It's cognitive, objective, based on moral realism. But it's basically an application of empiricism to ethics. So we look into the natural world to find ethical facts through empirical evidence, and therefore ethical propositions work in the same way as scientific propositions. Also, there's false propositions where they can't be proven. So, for example, God is good. That's not in the natural physical world, therefore it's a false proposition. And ethical language is a tool used to illustrate the ethical facts we've found. And then in terms of like actually applying the ethical facts, you move from an is to an or. So a fact such as X is good or bad becomes we ought to do or not do X. Now you might have not done this, guys, so this part could be practically useless to you, so sorry about that. But F.H. Bradley didn't directly talk about naturalism, he just kind of implied naturalistic principles in the ethic he put forward. So he was a late modern philosopher. You'll realise after a bit that every single one of these is a late modern philosopher because metaethics is a late modern idea. And so he put forward his ethic in a book called Ethical Studies. Very nice name to remember. So he wanted a middle ground between Bentham, think utilitarianism, which focuses a lot on the individual, and Kant, with the categorical imperatives that focus a lot on the community. So he put forward the idea of self-realisation, which is the realisation that our true self is an individual within a community, and to satisfy that self, we need to study and observe the values of said community and adopt them. So that's basically moving from an is to an ought. And so by fulfilling our role, by finding our station and following the values of said station, we eradicate our sense of isolation. Now for challenges to naturalism, you got good old Hume with the is-all problem, which basically states that empirical evidence isn't really empirical, nor is it evidence, as it's based on a value judgment. So if you take the proposition murder is bad, you're judging that on your value that you don't want people to die, and therefore the empirical evidence used isn't actually in the real world, and therefore you can reject naturalism. Then you got Moore, who we'll talk about more in 2 seconds, but he puts forward the naturalistic fallacy, which states that ethical language is indefinable as it's already in its simplest form. So in the same way that yellow is just yellow, good is just good, bad is just bad. And this also leads into the open question argument that basically naturalists basically work under the assumption that in terms of bad, there's always like a straightforward answer of what is bad. Like there's facts in the real world that tell us what bad is, and that works under the assumption that they're closed questions, but Moore basically says that as multiple concepts can derive from ethical language, they are open questions, and therefore we can reject naturalism and its supposed facts. Now, next on is intuitionism and Moore. So you can stick all the exact same shit in that you can for naturalism, it's just they work in different ways, and he is also a late modern philosopher, puts forward his ideas in a book called Principia Ethica. Quite wankery since he's not Latin, but moving on. So because good is just good, he argues we all have a universal moral intuition. So everybody's works in the exact same way, and we can intuitively recognise good and bad. And so they're intrinsic goods. So because good is just good, there are concepts that are good in themselves, such as friendship or aesthetic beauty. It's not common sense, as intuition is objective, common sense is subjective, and it's also not infallible. Infallible means it's perfect, so it'll never have any error. But as people's intuition are open to error, some people make mistakes. It needs maturity to practically apply our intuition to find good and bad. Now, once again, you may not have done this, guys, so apologies. But H.A. Pritchard was a late modern philosopher, but you didn't see that one coming, who put forward his contributions to intuitionism in Does Moral Philosophy Rest on a Mistake? So he focused on this idea of what we ought to do. So he disagreed with Moore that our intuition recognises intrinsic good and instead states our intuition recognises what we ought to do, which is also indefinable. So instead of the naturalistic way of going from an is to an ought, he focuses on going from an ought to a must do, so we have a duty to act on our immediate intuition. So then he differentiates between two types of thinking. So you got general thinking, which is assessing the facts of a situation, and moral thinking, which is applying our immediate intuition to a situation. And so he says that we need both of the above to act clearly, and he also warns against using general thinking for moral thinking. So next off, we've got challenges to intuitionism. So you got the argument from queerness by Mackey, obviously not referring to queer in a homophobic sense, he's just talking about it being odd. So he says that because intuition is non-cognitive, meaning we can't actually prove we have a moral intuition, it's just a bit weird to argue we do. Basically saying that more is just a bit odd. So then you've got Sidgwick, who argues that because there is significant disagreement on the intuitive truths that Moore argues exist, this suggests that they don't, and therefore we can reject intuitionism. And then you got Ayer, who basically combines the two. He doesn't actually refer to either of them, he just kind of does it naturally. But because intuition is non-cognitive, the disagreements caused by intuition will never be resolved, and therefore we can reject the idea of intuitionism. So next on the list is my personal favourite, Emotivism by A.J. Ayer. So now you're at the exact opposite shit for your introduction. It's non-cognitive, it's subjective, and it rejects moral realism. So as always, he's a late modern philosopher, and he's also a logical positivist, which is integral to the theory. If you don't know what that is, God knows what you're doing in your lessons, or you just might not have reached religious language yet, but he puts it forward in Language, Truth and Logic. So he refers to naturalism and intuitionism as pseudo-concepts because they are both non-cognitive, and using the verification principle they are therefore factually not significant, which is his definition of meaningless. So he refers to it as the hurrah/boo theory, because the whole term emotivism hasn't came about yet, but it's basically just that moral judgments are emotional responses to a situation. So for example, murder, boo. And so because of this, he says that the study of ethics should just be left to psychology and sociology because they can actually help to explain our emotional responses to a situation. But he also does accept that ethical statements are attempts to arouse or persuade others to feel the exact same way we do about a situation. Now, C.O. Stevenson is another guy that you may not have done, but he contributed to emotivism in the emotive meaning of ethical terms. He actually gave it its name, and he's also a late modern philosopher. So in the same way that Ayer argues that ethical statements are arousing, he argues they have a causal property of having the power to command, persuade, arouse, etc. They are dynamic. But the main thing that he criticises Ayer for is that for Ayer, ethical debate was meaningless. It was just two people bickering. So he says that there's propositions regarding belief. So these are beliefs that are factually enacted. For example, laws surrounding abortion. They're not facts, they're just beliefs. So then there are also propositions regarding attitude, and these are the emotional responses to these facts. So ethical debate is actually meaningful in the sense that our attitudes can change these factual beliefs. For example, gay marriage being legal now. So now for the challenges to emotivism. I put issues of emotivism because in my mind they're not valid challenges. If you think about it from an emotive perspective, these are just the geezers going boo. So ethics is useless. Leaving it to other fields of studies renders ethics pointless, including our exams, but this also includes the principles that millions of people throughout the world act on. So secondly, debate is also useless. You can talk about Stevenson in this. There's lots of positively received factual beliefs that have resulted from ethical debate, such as women having the right to vote. And now finally, this one's a bit more valid than the others. There is factually no absolute agreements. So for example, the Human Rights Charter, I'm pretty sure that near enough everybody's saying hurrah to that, but technically human rights aren't facts. It's kind of an issue. So finally, error theory. Once again, this is pretty much only useful for B questions, and it's supported by Mackey, Hume, etc. So if you're in an exam, you've chosen meta-ethics as a question and you're absolutely struggling, throw this in, easy marks. So you got the argument from queerness again by Mackey. This can basically be applied to every single thing within metaethics. Emotivism's a bit harder, but with Stevenson and factual beliefs, you can say that that is queer. So then the actual error itself is that morality is a construct, so it cannot be separated for humans, and therefore no absolute facts about morality can be found, and therefore all propositions are meaningless as they are non-cognitive, and therefore they're all wrong. It's now nearly 2 in the morning, I am very tired, so I'm going to go to bed. Goodbye.